The topic of this presentation is the proposed title of my book manuscript. There's a book project in the making, and the reason why I'm interested in this thing is I really want to get to the bottom of this question about how the Russian state rules its economy, right? And there had been a lot of research on the topic, and we know that there had been some very strong labels developed to describe the nature of the Russian state, right? So there is piranha capitalism, patrimonial capitalism, neo-patrimonialism is getting some credits here. The politics non-proliferation regime by Vladimir Gelman, suggesting that there are deliberate breakages between the political side of this state apparatus and the agencies that implement regulatory frameworks, right? So separating those executive agencies from the politicians who design public policy. So we do see a lot of examples of technocratic failures in Russian economic policymaking, social policymaking. There are evidence of bad governance in the sense that the public policy choices are somewhat misguided, and also very good policy proposals are not getting implemented, right? We see a lot of reports on rent seeking, disrespect of property rights, autocracy, hostile takeover. So we know that this is what is going on, and it's very characteristic of the business-state relations in Russia. All this is happening in an environment where Russia consistently scores badly on the corruption perception indices, and also, based on the surveys of public opinion, we know that over 1/3 of Russian people report seeing corruption in their immediate environment, right? So all this with the bureaucrats are not paid well. There is at the same time rise of interest in joining public service. Famously, then President Medvedev in 2011 rebuked the new generation for having a lot of interest in joining public service. And he perceived this as being evidence of those young people seeking the corruption opportunities that are associated with public sector jobs. So we can also name a lot of sort of very high profile sort of evidence of this bad governance, right? The reversal of the pension reform, when the state basically cannibalized all the previous efforts in developing modernized and sustainable pension system in Russia. But interestingly, there is no sort of very definitive timeline on things improving and then at some point getting worse. We also see sort of things like 2018 Belousov's proposal, the advisor to President Putin, proposing targeted tax increase on 16, and he named them by name, enterprises operating in Russia's mineral and chemical sector, right? But then we saw how effectively the Ministry of Finance was able to countervail that proposal, right? So there is really no pattern. We see a lot of bad things happening, and we see some sort of evidence of actually good policy choices. And we also see with some recent research that those instances of corruption and rent seeking can perfectly coincide with the promotion of collective goods and Russia's successful efforts in in the sphere, for instance, of national security, right? So with all this, I'm somewhat sort of dissatisfied with the tyrannic capitalism kind of framework of thinking about Russian state, and I suggest that the regulatory state framework is somewhat more productive as a framework for thinking about the relationship between state and society in Russia. What I'm trying to do in my book project is I'm sort of developing this notion that there is such a thing as autocratic regulatory state that is different from a regulatory state, the way we sort of observe the formations of regulatory state, say in advanced capitalist, mostly democratic economies, right? So when it comes to the creation of regulatory state, really we're talking about the economic considerations and the political considerations. And from the economic side, it's really the growth of an efficiency that the state regulation presumably pursues, right? And from the political consideration, there are distributional effects. And on that distributional political side, really, we're dealing with the conflicting pressures to satisfy the general public, presumably economic growth and efficiency and better business climate and lower levels of unemployment would all go along with this general public kind of side of the things. But on the other hand, there are special interests whose outlook on the policies promoting growth and efficiency might be quite different, right? So in that sense, autocracies are not that much different from democracies in having to sort of reconcile those conflicting pressures from the general public and the special interests. However, and this is what I suggest, the institutional underpinnings of authoritarian regulatory states are quite different, right? So it's not the policy, it's not the conflict that you need to reconcile special and general public interests, right? It's the fact that autocracies are limited in the choice of institutional mechanisms to enact those things in action. Okay? So when it comes to those institutional underpinnings, you know, we can look at the source of policy making, that is the the content of those regulations is defined by the laws written by politicians and the bylaws written by the bureaucrats. And the second category, the bureaucratic regulations, they are the results of a political decision to delegate rulemaking authority to the bureaucrats, right? So when it comes to the implementation mechanisms, they are very important. Basically, they're institutional mechanisms of regulations. We kind of know, and this goes to Gelman's point, that faulted implementation mechanisms can derail policy, right? We know that those are very important for the outcomes of regulatory intentions on the part of the state. We know from that same line of research that discretionary power that the bureaucrats have is very consequential in that it has enormous distributional consequence. It may reinforce corruption. It might create opportunities for predation on the part of bureaucrats. And it can also reinforce preferentialism in that if you give the bureaucrats the power to adjudicate in different instances of applying rules and regulations, they can give preferential treatment to some companies, groups, regions, but not others, right? So when it comes to this part of implementation, the amount of leeway that the bureaucrats have in enforcing regulations in practice, there are really two types of mechanisms to constraining the behavior of bureaucrats. There are the exposed and ex ante, and then not inventing anything new here. With the exposed mechanisms, it's really the mechanisms of control and oversight. And here, transparency is very important. public accountability of those bureaucratic agencies. It all goes along with, with the ability of the public to complain about misapplication of rules and regulations, right? So free press is essential. You have to have vibrant civil society that can organize the resistance and sort of get those instances to the public view. The rule of law goes a long way, right? So we want to think that you can come up with those ex-post mechanisms of discipline and bureaucrats because you can litigate against them, right? So with all this being said, there is a clear understanding that those things are problematic for many authoritarian regimes. Not all of them, not to the same extent. But there is this fundamental sort of conflict between the nature of authoritarianism and the ex-post mechanisms of accountability. Ex-ante mechanisms, however, are pretty much in line with what autocracies can do, right? So those are statutory mechanisms. Those are the kind of mechanisms that you put in the regulations themselves, right? Those are the regulations on your bureaucracies, right? Those are the institutional designs of the regulatory institutions. And I see them as being more in line with how many authoritarian regimes function, and primarily how the Russian authoritarianism functions. So let's go back to the politician's dilemma, collective versus particularistic goods. So with the growth promotion, investment climate, better business climate, it's clear that those will be sort of considered as part of creating this vibrant business environment, growing the private sector, collective goods, right? With the particularistic goods, those are the benefits that go to the elites and core constituents. And we can think of the bureaucracies actually being that type of the political constituency for authoritarianism, right? So we can think that the bureaucrats, and if we think about the role of the executive agencies, the regional governments in the Russian Federation, they can mobilize electoral turnout, right? They can appease the population. They can mobilize resources from the industries that are located in their regions or under their control, right? So there is a lot of what they can do in order to support the autocratic rule, and their loyalty is very important to Putin's Russia, right? So I suggest that particularistic benefits, that this bureaucratic discretion, this discretionary power to implement rules and regulations in the way they see it fit, is actually a reward to those local bureaucrats, right? Those are the rent opportunities for those bureaucrats. So I see them as not that I see the formulation of public policy in a way that creates a lot of bureaucratic discretion as potentially a conscious decision on the part of the political elites, right? So how do those autocrats design regulatory enforcement? So if they, I reason this way, so if they write very specific, detailed regulations, those detailed specific regulations can make it harder for the bureaucrats to misinterpret and misapply those, so to apply them in capricious manner, right? So if it's very specific, if it says from A to Z what has to be done. On the other hand, if it's either the absence of regulatory policy in a specific area, or very vague kind of policy that allows bureaucrats to have a lot of leeway in turning it whatever they want, right? On the other hand, if autocrats write allow those bureaucrats to have a lot of discretion, they can create the particularistic benefits to the bureaucrats. They can reward the bureaucracies with opportunities for bribery, basically, right? So I think that is the decision set for the autocrats who design regulatory regimes. So the question then becomes, under what conditions autocrats would want a constrained bureaucracy versus discretionary bureaucracy, right? And here, the concern for the aggregate economic welfare comes back into picture, right? So if your rule is threatened by the lack of overall economic progress, right, then probably you will be more cautious of extending those discretionary powers to your bureaucrats in the form of rewarding their loyalty. Right? So there is a trade-off, and I suggest that we can see potentially this trade-off being played out if we compare the periods of shrinking and expanding oil revenues, for instance, right? So I would expect that under the shrinking state resources, the kleptocratic mechanisms will become just too expensive for the autocrats to use as a reward strategy. And when popular mobilization threatens the regime, I would also expect that autocrats will be more cautious using the discretionary power to reward bureaucracies. Instead, they will be more inclined to constrain bureaucracies. So they apply the regulatory policy in a way that is conducive of the collective benefits. All right, so what I will be presenting you some result of some empirical investigation on my part. I collected data on all kinds of regulations that exist, that were enacted in Russia and were in place in any specific year. I subtracted the ones that were phased out, annulled, or yeah. So the source of those data is commercial service. It's called Garant. They get their data from the Ministry of Justice and from the regional offices of the Ministry of Justice. So it spans sort of 1990s and up to 2018. For me, the additional advantage of using this service to get the data is that they actually read all those documents and decode them, right? So I know more about those documents by using Garant than if I didn't use them, right? So in the analysis I present today, I sort of approximate this notion that of discretion or the lack of discretion, the constraint, by the number of regulations, because I consider all regulations. I don't go sort of sector by sector or specific or policy area by policy area. I aggregate across all of them. And at the outset, I will say that there is a very high degree of correlation. I also have the data on the length of regulations, right? So the length of regulations is actually overall is correlated with the number of regulations. There is this. I'm trying to get at this notion of how specific the regulatory framework is, right? So I have some graphs plotting the overtime changes. Those are only the federal regulatory documents for the first set of analysis. So those are all regulations in any kind of sphere that has any kind of relationship to economic activity. And this one is only the statutory regulations, only laws. And you see that actually, I mean, those graphs, they look differently, but you see there is sort of some overlap in the pattern that initially in the early 1990s we see an increase in the production of those regulations, and it kind of leveled off, right? And then we see the second peak of increases, we see as time goes by, the regulatory framework becomes more nuanced from my standpoint. All right, so let me walk you through some regression analysis I did. This one is with the federal regulatory documents. I got the data for the oil rents as a percentage of GDP, and I regressed on the number of economic regulations, all the regulations pertaining to economic spheres of activities, laws, and very specific instructions that are given to the bureaucrats, right? And I see that at the time of declining oil revenues, there is an increase in rulemaking in the federal regulations, right? So I see that when the oil rents go down, the number of laws go up, and the other way around, right? So. And I find this to be consistent with my expectation that when the resources of the state shrink, we also see reinvigorated activity in specifying more detailed regulations. And then I also suggested that the protests that threaten the stability of the regime could facilitate reinvigorate the rulemaking. For the protest analysis, I used the data set by Lankina, who counted the number of protest events in different parts of Russia, in different cities of Russia. So I have a regional panel here spanning from 2007 to 2017. And I see there that the number of protest episodes in the region, the previous year, is positively correlated with the annual increase in the number of regional regulations and bureaucracy-driven regulations, the bylaws, but not the regional laws. And I think by itself it's a very interesting finding, because the regional legislators, unlike the governors, are elected by the public and might not be subject to the same pressure as the parts of the federal bureaucracy, right? Or the vertical plastic. All right, so I will skip this. I will go over some other related aspects from that previous analysis, the relationship between protests and regulatory initiatives. So in some of my regression models, I see that statutory regulations, that is the regional laws, have actually negative relationship. And in some of those, it's statistically significant, but it's not sort of consistent from one model to another, right? And I see that the size of protests does not measure, interestingly, again, it's open to interpretation, the size of protests as measured by the number of participants does not matter. It's the fact that there was a protest. And also I find that it's an immediate, more or less immediate effect. It doesn't last more than 2 years. So let me go to some concluding points, right? So when I see that oil revenues, the decline in oil revenues leads to reinvigorated rulemaking, and when I see that the number of protests also leads to more regulations, I interpret this as the authoritarian push towards greater economic efficiency and away from favoring particularistic benefits, right? When the authoritarian rule is threatened, they revert back to favoring collective goods. And another sort of thing, sort of what larger picture do we see here? Well, I interpret this as an evidence that the Russian state uses the ex-ante mechanisms of bureaucratic control, right? So they do have the mechanism that they actually rely on this, I think, right? They figured out how it works. And this is sort of the last point that I wanted to make. So, like I'm thinking about, so what does it all mean about the nature of Russian authoritarianism, about the nature of Russian business-state relations? And sort of there are a lot of people in this room who might vividly remember the explanation for rolling out Glasnost initiative in the late Soviet period, right? Glasnost was proposed by Gorbachev as a response to the increasing inefficiency of Soviet bureaucracy, right? So it was, it was the shirking of the Soviet bureaucrats that was blamed for all the failures of the Soviet model, right? So Glasnost was put in place in order to remedy that. It was opening up the public space so the people could report instances of abuse, right? So that people could complain. And you know what? From what I see now in Russia, they will never suffer from that problem because they discovered another way of disciplining their bureaucrats. So that is sort of my message today. Thank you.